This semester, the Open Classroom has been dealing with the subject of how we go about repairing a divided America. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am a professor of policy within the School of Public Policy here at Northeastern University. My co-faculty member is Professor Jonathan Kaufman, who heads up our journalism program. Tonight, we're happy to be able to introduce you to Professor Meredith Clark, about whom you'll hear more momentarily. We will cut away from our normal programming at around 6:25 or 6:30 to get an on-the-spot report from Georgia, where a trial is going on involving many of the subjects that we've been discussing this semester around race and hate crimes. If you have questions, we urge you to enter them into our chat or Q&A boxes, and we will get to as many questions from our widely distributed audience as we can tonight. And having said that, I turn the microphone over to my colleague, Professor Jonathan Kaufman.
Thanks very much, Ted. I'm thrilled to have Professor Meredith Clark joining us. She's someone who just came to the journalism school as a professor of journalism and in the communication studies department. Professor Clark has both a journalism background, where she worked as a writer, columnist, and an editor, but also as an academic, where she's done really pioneering work on Black Twitter, on the whole question of cancel culture and what that means, and how information is kind of distributed in this 21st century news ecosystem that we now live in. She's also been very involved in efforts to bring more diversity to American newsrooms, and she'll probably talk, I hope, candidly about some of the challenges that we face there. As Professor Landsmark said, at 6:30 we're going to be going to Georgia, where one of our recent graduates is covering the Arbery trial, which has raised a lot of these issues involving the role of the media, both in covering race and hate crimes, but also the challenges facing journalists of color within the media. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Clark.
All right, thanks. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Ooh, let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'm the daughter of a Southern preacher, so I do a little call and respond every now and then. Before I get started, I've got 3 apologies to offer. So the first is the most serious, and that is that I'm still somewhat wounded by something that happened to me my senior year in high school. I was on the speech team and competed in the impromptu speaking category, where you had about 5 minutes to prepare a quick speech on a topic, and all you could have was 1 index card. I made it all the way to the state finals and the last round, and I lost. I came in 2nd place to Coleman Eldridge, who is now a Democratic strategist in Kentucky. And I'm still carrying around some of that hurt. So I move slides around and change things in the talks that I give, even to this day. So when I'm asked to come out and give a talk, even like this one, I was changing things on the T on my way here. So I apologize if one of my slides seems a little bit out of order. My second apology is that I'm breaking a rule of speech and communication, and that I'm chewing gum. I take a medication that makes my mouth really dry, and it's kind of hard to give a talk when you've got a Sierra Desert sort of thing going on in your mouth. So I'm chewing a little gum to keep things working smoothly. And then the third and final apology I have to make to you, I've actually forgotten just that quickly, but we're gonna get into things. I am excited to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to you. And as you can see on my first slide here, I took this as a question rather than an assertion, rather than a matter of fact. Because as I talk tonight, I want to lay out the case that America has never been divided but it has been the subject of domination and a place that is built, a country, a society that is built on a broken foundation. And so I go back to January 6th of this very year. January 6th was the day for me that I stopped believing in the ideals of American democracy the way they had been taught to me all of my life. After watching Rodney King in the 1990s be beaten by 4 police officers, caught on tape and with a host of witnesses, after seeing unarmed Black men, women, and children gunned down and otherwise assaulted by law enforcement or by white figures in their community, as we're going to hear about in the case of those who killed Ahmaud Arbery. Even after doing the research and the work that I've done with social media activists who use these tools to tell stories that are otherwise untold by news media, I still hadn't quite lost my faith in American democracy. But when I turned on my TV on January 6th and saw that what had begun as a protest and a demonstration had devolved into widespread insurrection, the ideals that I had about American democracy and the way journalism upholds it completely crumbled. And so I come to you as obviously a Black woman, a Black feminist, a person who is pretty privileged when you think about it. I have the privilege to get an education and to be able to read and write and think for a living, in comparison with my grandmother, who had to quit her college education to be a domestic in order to provide for her family. I have the privilege of saying that American democracy and the way that we think about it and the way that we uphold it as an ideal is completely flawed and factually dishonest. I come to this from a long line of work. So as Professor Kaufman said, before I was in academia, I was a journalist. And I came to journalism because in my neighborhood, I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, I saw things that were happening that weren't being covered by local news. And when I read the local newspaper subscription that I bought for myself because my parents, with their deep distrust of media, would not subscribe to our local paper, I came home one year during the summer. This happened during the summer after my first year in the Master's of Journalism program at Florida A&M University, my alma mater. And I read this specific line. It has come to the editor's attention that the Herald Leader neglected to cover the civil rights movement. We regret the omission. Neglected to cover the civil rights movement. The movement that gave me the very life that I have right now. The struggle that allows me voting rights, the ability to go to integrated schools, to arguably move about the country rather freely, to sit where I want to sit, first class on an airplane, front seat on a bus. Neglected to cover. Not even taking responsibility for saying that the Herald Leader chose not to cover the civil rights movement. Where there were photographers in Lexington and reporters in Lexington who were capturing this story, decisions were made inside the Herald Leader's editorial body that was not news that was interesting to its readers or profitable to the paper. And so I kept these things in mind during the early years of my journalism career. And as I studied about newsroom diversity, I came across the 1967-1968, there's a release and a re-release, of the Kerner Commission report. And of all the indictments of American institutional failings that the Kerner Commission pointed out that were contributors to race riots across the country in 1967, they chose news media as one. And they said that the news media had failed to accurately describe for Americans what life was like in Black ghettos. And even that framing I found problematic because at this time there was a Black middle class. There were Black upper class citizens in pockets across the country. But they made this statement that our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black and one white, or one white and one Black, excuse me, separate and unequal. Now, since this time, we know that America has definitely had more than one color line. In fact, in this day and age, we're dealing with less of a color line, the way that W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of it, and more so a kaleidoscope of identities, backgrounds, races, and cultural experiences. And as such, I took these historical points of reference, and on one of my last days working in the newsroom at the Tallahassee Democrat, I was reading this story from Slate magazine. The author, Farhad Manjoo, wrote about something that we would eventually call Black Twitter. It wasn't called that at the time. In fact, this is the story that kind of gave Black Twitter that particular name. So at this point, I was a columnist, but I had started my career as a headline writer, as a copy editor. And so the headline grabbed me right from the beginning because headlines are designed to give people an overview or an idea of the story without having to read the entire story. And I read this headline and immediately thought to myself, how Black people use Twitter? Like all of them, my dude? Okay, I'm a Black person. I don't see my experience reflected in this, nor do I see the experiences of Black people that I talk to on this social networking site day in and day out. What I see is attention to Black behavior that is deemed deviant. And so I took this story to UNC, and when my first dissertation topic sort of collapsed, I worked on this one instead, making the case that Black Twitter was in fact community and that it had a specific process for engaging in resistance in order to change news media narratives about Black people. So I came up with this: 3 levels of connection that make up Black Twitter. The first is personal communities, those places where we have reciprocal relationships with people that we know offline as well as online. This was informed by people who told me that they use Twitter to do things like gossip about their coworkers without people in the office knowing. The second level of connection was neighborhoods. I called them thematic nodes. But there are these topics of conversation that people return to again and again and again. My neighborhoods, some of them were defined externally by things like television. Thursday nights from 8 to 11 o'clock for many years, you would find me in Shondaland with a bunch of other people tweeting about Shonda Rhimes' TV shows on ABC. You could also find me in Black academic Twitter. You might find me in Black beauty couture Twitter. And that reminds me of my third apology. I'm not wearing my mask because I didn't want to mess up my lipstick. I'm sorry about that. But you could find me in one of those places. And that is true for a number of people, including folks who were tweeting and talking about things like racial justice and police reform, reproductive justice, voting rights, and the like. And then finally, I saw that there was a third level of connection, which I call the meta network. The meta network is temporally limited and temporally based. It's limited by time and how much time and attention people are giving to a particular incendiary event at a specific moment in time. Now, these events could be anything. A topic of conversation that characterized Black Twitter for a number of years was the idea of $200 dates. That if you weren't spending $200 on a date, you were broke and you did not deserve to be in the dating marketplace. But there were also some more serious topics of conversation, such as the push for racial justice, the awareness of police surveillance in low-income neighborhoods, and the importance of mobilizing people in forms of activism. I saw all 3 of these things come together during what I call a summer of accountability in 2013. That's when there were 3 specific cases that illustrated the process of resistance that Black Twitter engaged in order to shift narratives about Black people and Black life. The first is on the top right-hand side, and I apologize for the quality of the image, but it is a reaction to Paula Deen giving a deposition in 2013 about how she created somewhat of a racist atmosphere at work by openly fantasizing about antebellum looking servants for events and allowing people to use racial epithets in the workplace. Black Twitter makes jokes of everything. Everything is eventually funny to Black Twitter. And so in reading this deposition, there were media personalities who tweeted out parts of it. And people created a hashtag, or rather took Paula Deen's show hashtag, and mashed it up with references to Jim Crow era racism and Southern soul food. And so you got tweets like coon on the cob, Paula's best dishes. Or Loving versus Virginia ham, referencing the Loving versus Virginia case, which ultimately made interracial marriage legal in the United States. That was the first case in June of 2013. In July, the second case was about juror B37. Juror B37 was one of the jurors in George Zimmerman's murder case about the killing of Trayvon Martin. And the day after the verdict was announced, this juror went on CNN and announced that she had a book deal. And so one person who saw what had happened with the Paula's Best Dishes hashtag, that you could make enough noise online to cause an offline reaction, said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to let this happen. We're not going to let you profit from this family's pain. You had a role in that jury. You did not actually uphold that role. We are not going to let you profit. And so she organized this petition online. It circulated without a hashtag, but with reference to Juror B37. And within about 36 hours, Black Twitter got Juror B37's book deal canceled. Keep that cancellation in mind. We're coming back to that in a little bit. The third and final case in Black Twitter Summer of Accountability was the hashtag Solidarity is for White Women. This was the result of 2 Black feminists talking to one another online after a white male proclaimed feminist admitted that he had been abusive to Black feminists and feminists of color, and yet no white feminist really stood up for Black women and said, we knew this was happening, we didn't protect you, we didn't include you in our feminist ethics of care that we claim to profess. And so one Black Twitter user, Mickey Kendall, who has written a book about hood feminism, said to another that solidarity is for white women because we see that people will ignore their role of gender and culpability in maintaining white dominance in our society. And so what I saw in terms of patterns with all of this work was that Black Twitter engaged in Black digital resistance through a series of stages or steps that I always explain linearly, but don't actually always proceed that way. So the first one is identification or self-selection. That is positively identifying as a Black person, or as I'm often asked, can someone who's not Black be a part of Black Twitter? Or as a person who has close connection to Black people and deep understanding of Black culture. I won't say that you can be a part of Black Twitter, but you can understand what Black Twitter is doing. So the first step is identification and self-selection. The next is participation. What participation looks like, it's on the earlier slide, and that is using specific hashtags to indicate that you are part of a discussion that other users are having. You have something to contribute, perhaps you want to talk to others, maybe you're seeking information. That is one of the ways that you participate. Prior to Twitter coming out with the functionality of quote tweeting, we might have called the way that people sort of copied and pasted tweets and then retweeted them, we might have called that participation as well. Participation could be crosstalk by adding or tagging another user in a tweet. There are a number of ways that you would participate. The third step was affirmation. That is the answer that you got when someone else spoke back to you in this vast internet landscape and said, yeah, I hear what you're saying. They could disagree with you. It doesn't mean that it's agreement, but it means that you are being heard and the speech acts that you are conducting are being received. Then there's reaffirmation. And I use the example of Black Lives Matter signs in neighborhoods, on t-shirts, and on hats as the proof that reaffirmation exists. 20 years ago, if you had affixed a hashtag to the slogan Black Lives Matter with no spaces in between, someone would have thought you had made a terrible typographical error. But instead, reaffirmation indicates that people understand enough about what's happening in digital online culture and speech that they can carry that meaning into offline spaces and use it to signal the same meanings that are being discussed online. Finally, in this process, we have vindication. Now, using the example that we have tonight, we know that we have a student or an alumna rather, of Northeastern who's covering the Ahmaud Arbery trial or the trial of his killers. Bringing those people to justice, bringing them through the justice system, the demands that they be held accountable for his death, that is an example of Black Twitter's vindication, where you organize, you tweet, you speak, you recirculate images to the end that you want. The end in this specific case was to bring these three men to account for their actions in a court of law. Other examples of vindication over the years have included the Academy of Motion Pictures Sciences, including more members of color, the Golden Globes deciding not to air a broadcast after they were exposed for the Hollywood Foreign Press Association was exposed for not having any Black members. The protests that are organized that speak back to wrongs that otherwise would not garner attention. All of these could be considered forms of vindication. So as I study this, I think about something that Jay Rosen calls the people formerly known as the audience. As Professor Kaufman was discussing earlier, for so many years, news creation has taken place in a space where there is a one-directional sort of production of news and information. Reporters and editors decide what the news of the day is. They put the news out there. As Professor Kaufman mentioned, if you had a problem with it, you could write a letter. Jay Rosen, a futurist and a professor at New York University, has called the people formerly known as the audience those people who use their blogs and now their Twitter accounts, their Snapchat accounts, their Instagram accounts, and every form of social media that you can think of to create counter narratives that confront the ones that we get from mainstream media news and try to set the record straight about marginalized and disenfranchised communities. Black Twitter, you could consider as part of the people formerly known as the audience. Over the years, I've used this framework to do some research about Black Twitter, including this report, which was produced for the Knight Foundation. And even in the construction of the headline of this report, you can still see how there is a gap between the way that we understand what Black people are doing online, what marginalized people are doing online, and what the assumption of the norm or society or everyone else is doing online. So this report focused on Black Twitter, Asian American Twitter, and feminist Twitter. And in it, we discussed how people were using Twitter to create the kind of news that they weren't getting from mainstream media outlets. And so you can see this is one of the founders of Twitter, probably the most prominent one, Jack, quotes from our report. that participants often use Twitter to circulate and raise awareness about issues of concern on their own terms without waiting for professional journalists to take interest. That's my words. And so, looking at how Black Twitter has been effective, just to show you another case, there was one hashtag in 2014 that caught on 3 days after the shooting death of Michael Brown at the hands of Darren Wilson. And it was called "If They Gun Me Down." What users did was to take that hashtag and to juxtapose pictures of themselves, one of them appearing respectable and the other appearing in a way that was comfortable to them, but one that could easily be distorted by news media. The pictures that were used in the days after Michael Brown's killing varied. There were generally two prime images that were used. There was one where he was standing on his grandmother's porch, and it was debated publicly over whether he was throwing up a peace sign or a gang sign. The other was where he was wearing his cap and gown, and it was taken as part of his senior photos. And so people recreated these two images and said with the hashtag, "If they gun me down, make sure people know that I was much more than the deviant image that might be used when people talk about my death." So this is some of the work that Black Twitter has done leading up to the ongoing protests of what I initially thought was going to be the Black Lives Matter movement between 2014 and 2016. Cannot tell you what kind of alarm I had in seeing that we were going to have another round of protests in 2020. Just want to do a quick time check. Where are we in terms of bringing in our guests? Still good? All right. So as I talk about the meta network of Black Twitter, I use Black Lives Matter as a way to explain how these levels of connection work. So if you'll recall, you have personal communities where you are reciprocally connected to people with whom you have an offline relationship. You have neighborhoods where you talk with people about specific topics over and over again. You know that those are the people who maybe share the same views or at least are interested in engaging on these topics. And then you have the meta network. The Black Lives Matter movement illustrated these connective processes as well as the process of Black digital resistance in several ways. First, people in personal communities who had no geographic or no familial connection to the victims whose deaths we saw played on loops on social media captured by cell phone footage, began to talk about those deaths and their implications among their personal communities. As different names began to trend as hashtags, they reached out and looked for more information among neighborhoods where people had been talking about issues like white violence against Black bodies and police reform. And when things hit a fever pitch, when the demand for someone to be held accountable for an assault or a death reached a certain crescendo, reached a certain point, the meta network of Black Twitter became visible, all through the use of this hashtag, Black Lives Matter. In terms of vindication, Black Lives Matter has been successful, arguably, in shifting public consciousness, in getting news organizations to examine their coverage critically and think about the pictures that they use, the sources that they use, and how they frame victims and regular Black people living their lives. It has been successful in organizing people in disparate places for a common cause. And so it, I say, is the ultimate case study in the process of Black digital resistance. But in the time since the initial wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, which I chronicle from about 2013 to 2016, leading right up to the election, one of the things that has dramatically shifted is the percentage of Americans who use social networking platforms. So in 2010 and 2011, when I first started studying Black Twitter, one of the reasons that Black Twitter was newsworthy was because of its uniqueness. That is the so-called overrepresentation of Black people on this particular social networking site. And because of the broadcast nature of the site, people could see the numbers of Black people who were on the site using hashtags and driving trends. At that time, the overrepresentation was credited as more than 25% of all Black users of the internet, not all Black people in America, but Black American users of the internet were using Twitter. So this image I just took from Pew Research Center's reports today. You can see how social media use has changed over time. And if you take a good look at this chart, you can see that there are two platforms in particular that dominate the American use of social media. What are they? Facebook's number one. Let's look down there between 2019 and 2021. It's Facebook and YouTube. Twitter, what color is Twitter there? Twitter is that kind of light green. You can barely see it on this chart. But you can see that comparatively, Twitter is not as widely used by anyone in the United States. Now, Black users still remain in one of the two lead groups. They were outpaced by Hispanic or Latin users within the last 4 to 5 years. But as you can see, these are still broadcast-style platforms that depend on relationships, depend on affinity for a particular kind of coverage, and yet have an undue influence on the way that we think about our social reality, and specifically the way we think about news and news delivery. So where were we? We were talking about social media use, and specifically how the example of how social media use by folks who are interested in racial justice and police reform and really setting things right in the country have led to moments like Ahmaud Arbery's killers being led to at least the justice system, if not justice itself. So I showed you this graphic because I want you to have an understanding of exactly how small the percentage of users of Twitter is with respect to other ways that people can get and exchange information. These channels that are extraneous to mainstream news media sources. So Twitter's pretty low down there. And this subgroup of users, as Twitter calls us, has had this outsized influence. But what Twitter users, Black Twitter in particular, are up against is the way that content can be produced and shared, and specifically misinformation and how it can be amplified on other social networking platforms. So 10 years into this study, I'm now thinking about something that I never thought I would connect to my study of Black digital culture and in specific Black Twitter. And that started with the idea of people being canceled. So as I mentioned earlier, we had an example of Paula Deen's contracts with the Food Network and her endorsement deals being canceled as a result of the things that Black Twitter brought to light and the protests that took place in this online space that had offline repercussions. That was 2013. 5 years later, as you can see by the date on the story, being canceled has become such a phenomenon that the New York Times is writing about it. And if you actually go to the story, even today, I believe you can use that interactive to see who or what has been canceled. But I talked to this reporter because he wanted to know what it meant for someone to be canceled. And the way that we understand canceling now and so-called cancel culture is something that I really take issue with after having studied Black Twitter and having a personal lived experience with Black vernacular culture. You see, in Black vernacular culture, we have these ways of sort of checking people or confronting them. And as a recent MacArthur Grant winner, Sophia Noble, has noted, that is sometimes unruly. It doesn't follow the norms of decorum and interaction and debate. Sometimes it's loud, it's brash, it's mean, it's cutting, sometimes it's funny. What we now call being canceled for decades, if not centuries, in Black communities has been called calling people out, dragging them, reading them for filth, and checking them. But because of the way news media is able to frame certain subjects and certain topics, that whole process and that history has been lost in a hyper focus on what's happening online without an inquiry about its history. And so we get call out culture, or as it's commonly called today, cancel culture. And I take issue with cancel culture as a term for one particular reason, and that is because the assignment of the term culture to being canceled suggests that there is something different and deviant about what people are doing. We've seen that the former president himself said that calling people out online isn't activism. Those folks who got Juror B37's book deal canceled, the people who got Paula Dean's show canceled, those people who have demanded justice, at least trials for those who have taken Black lives or otherwise harmed Black bodies and Black communities, I think they beg to differ. But there is something to be said about, as the story on the right says, how algorithms contribute to this outsized amplification of the online conversations and debates that are being framed as canceling and cancel culture. And so in 2020, in the midst of the protests around the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, a number of writers, creatives, artists came together to write this letter on justice and open debate. And though they never used the specific words cancel culture, they criticized the cultural evolution in which people were called to task for presenting ideas, perspectives, or even creating harm to different groups and individuals, and being met with swift retribution because of the amplification of those issues on social media. I took issue with this letter in particular because it was presented right in the middle of a second sort of revolution for racial justice. We're in the lead up to the 2020 election. We have got an unarmed Black woman who was shot and killed in her own home, in her bed as she slept. We have at least 2 more cases that are in news media of unarmed Black people being killed through acts of racialized violence. And yet, a group of very privileged people is concerned about how we engage one another in debate. I really took issue with that. And I took issue with it because it sets a tone for us misunderstanding how Black people have used technology, and specifically communicative technology, through the ages to present a counter-narrative that is not covered in mainstream media and thus is not well understood. The process of using those technologies dates all the way back to the publication of Freedom's Journal in the 1800s, where 2 Black free men published their first issue and said that we wish to plead our own cause, that for too long, one Black person who may step out of the norms of society has been used as an implication that all Black people are deviant, that our causes are misunderstood. It connects to Ida B. Wells's Red Record, where Southern states and the United States federal government wanted to ignore the lynchings that were taking place in the South. It connects to the alternative press that the Black press created and continued to serve and function during the 1960s, when papers like my hometown paper, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, neglected to cover the civil rights movement. The history of calling out and making very clear the problems that are part of this society because of its broken foundation are historically rooted in Black traditions. The use of technology to call these things out, to present them, and to say that this is a problem not only for Black communities, but for all of us, has a very long history. We are just dealing with it in a different era and with different tools. As I mentioned, I specifically take issue with the use of the word culture to talk about cancel culture because it takes something from Black Twitter, extracts it from its historical and contemporary meanings, and recasts it as part of the so-called culture wars. So if you're familiar with the politics of the 1980s in specific, where the Republicans who are now empowered with the shift of Democrats who left the Democratic Party as part of the Southern strategy and aligned themselves with Republicans, are now using cultural issues in order to wage political warfare and political campaigns with one another. And so James Davison Hunter, a scholar at UVA, terms this the culture wars. And he says that there is a war between the ways that we think American society should function. On the right, as on the right in this graphic, you have conservative values, including patriotism, the right to bear arms, the protection of life in the womb. On the left, as with leftist values, you have feminism, the inclusion of LGBTQIA+ folks, the right to choose your reproductive, to make your reproductive choices, and the like. And I noticed that the use of this term culture created a convenient collapse for us to understand what's happening when people are being called out and accountability is being demanded with this shift towards pushing America one way or another. So I decided to look it up. How is it that culture became the buzzword that we thought of when we thought of someone being canceled? Why don't we just say they're canceled? Why do we call it cancel culture? And what I found was that in 2014, culture was the word of the year. And Merriam-Webster provided a definition that helped me to understand why assigning cancel culture and using that specific term is such a problem. So just in case you can't see this definition, I'll read the second sentence. The term conveys a kind of academic attention to systematic behavior and allows us to identify and isolate an idea, issue, or group. We speak of a culture of transparency or consumer culture. One of the things that this definition does not mention is how culture was weaponized in the 1960s and throughout until the 1990s to paint Black folks, Black voters, Black citizens of this country, again, as deviant, with images of a culture of poverty where Black families were broken, didn't have families in the home, Black people were lazy, a culture of underachievement where Black students could not achieve in the same way as their peers were. This is something that, and here's where my slides are a bit out of order, that Eduardo Bonilla-Silva, a sociologist at Duke University, refers to as racial grammar. Specifically, racial grammar is that language that allows us to make references to race without talking about race. He says racial grammar structures cognition, vision, and even feelings on all sorts of racial matters. This grammar normalizes the standards of white supremacy as the standards for all sorts of social events and transactions. Racial grammar provides the deep structure, the logic, and the rules of proper composition of racial statements, and more importantly, of what can be seen, understood, and even felt about racial matters. But these rules, like all rules, are transacted and negotiated so that ideological rule and order are always in tension and conflict. There are coded meanings in racial grammar and in the way that we talk about race without mentioning race. And as proof of this, I use this clip from Lee Atwater, recorded in 1988. It was recorded in secret, and I believe The Nation just made this available not too long ago, where he talks about some of the ways that the Southern strategy leading into the Nixon, excuse me, not the Nixon, but the Reagan administration worked with abstraction in order to sort of obfuscate the meanings when people referred to Black people and Black communities. So I'm going to try and play this audio. I pray it works, so that you can hear this in Lee Atwater's own words.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Just in case you couldn't hear what he said there, and I will repeat the racial epithets word for word. He said in the 1950s, you could say nigger, nigger, nigger. But by 1968, you can't say nigger anymore because it hurts you with voters. So what you say instead is forced busing. You talk about moving people from one place to another. And so you don't have to say anything about Black people. You don't have to say anything about race at all. But you engage in this form of abstraction so that you can talk about a number of issues that hit at a specific kind of culture without having to be explicit about them. And this is what Bonilla Silva is talking about when he refers to racial grammar. So as an example, it's another call and respond for you here. I'm going to ask you what people are talking about when they refer to urban contemporary radio.
He'll talk to us a little today about the
talking
wrong-headed trade deals, what he's doing now with
Rap.
President Biden in the Senate.
Historically,
He's
who makes rap
always
music?
been on the forefront of thinking creatively
Black
about
people.
new trade.
So one way of referring to Black music without calling it Black music. Give you one more. Somebody got one, the R&B, right? I'll give you an educational example. When we talk about school, actually this is geographic. When we talk about schools in the inner city, what are we talking about? Students in the inner city, students that are at risk. What kind of students are we talking about? I heard details, poor Black students in particular, poor Latino students, right? Sometimes we're talking about poor white students, but not often. And so you understand how racial grammar works. Okay. That leads us to this idea, I'm gonna go backwards here, about cancel culture, looking at the graphic on the right. You don't have to talk about how Black people are making a fuss or demanding accountability or using social networking platforms to draw attention to issues of concern in their lives. You don't have to get that specific. If you just say that what's happening is cancel culture, then you've got this amorphous definition that you can include a number of things in. And it's not limited to the right. Governor Andrew Cuomo, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, when he was facing the initial allegations of sexual harassment recently, referred to that as cancel culture. So you've got this amorphous definition that now begins to cover a number of different things. But what it effectively does is delegitimizes these social media conversations such that anything that you assign that label of cancel culture to then becomes an issue of them versus us and a battle for culture in the United States. One last example for you about how this amorphous nature and this abstraction works and why social media and paying its attention to social media is so important with it. Professor Kaufman mentioned the debate over critical race theory and how mainstream news media was sort of late to seeing how the idea of critical race theory was being weaponized specifically from the right. So you've got here two conservative, I will say they were conservative provocateurs. I don't use the term alt-right because I think it's a failing of news media, and happy to talk about that during question and answer. But you see them interacting with one another. So I want you to pay attention specifically to the last tweet on this slide and then the next tweet I'm going to show you. This one's by Christopher Rufo, and he says, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category." So here we go again with racialized grammar. We had forced busing. We had school choice is another one. We have at-risk students. And in 2021, we've got critical race theory. And he says this, and this is the hammer for me. "The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans." The subtext here is white Americans. He's not talking about all Americans. He's talking about Americans like himself. So again, you've got this practice of abstraction that has recognized that the conversations that have taken place, that have come out of Black Twitter in particular, that have crossed over into our everyday language, are so powerful and need to be stopped or checked that we have to come up with a term that is abstract enough to gather all the people who might feel threatened by the push for racial equality, for dignity, for any sort of reconciliation, and use a term, two terms in this case, cancel culture is one, critical race theory being the other, to put an end to these things. The last 2 points that I want to leave you with, and I hope that I've presented enough for us to have conversation, because I don't mind talking, but I enjoy conversation more, is that when I thought about the title of this course, Repairing a Divided America, I thought to myself that America is not, in fact, a house divided. It is a house built on a broken foundation. And what we are having to deal with now are the consequences of trying to either put this house back together or, as so many of us are working for, to build it anew again. Thank you.
Well, that was terrific. I think that every time I hear Professor Clark talk about something, I always kind of walk away shaking my head that things that seem so clear and obvious were so obscure to me. But so I guess I wanted to start out by asking you kind of two questions. One is about the broken foundations. Do you think the media is also resting on these broken foundations? And within the media's dealing with it, what do they need to be doing? Where would you call out the media?
Yes, so I would say that every American institution that we can think of is resting on the broken foundation. When your country begins with genocide and displacement, there is no building a solid foundation. It cannot be done. If it had been done through cooperation, if it had been done through mutual participation And if it had not been done through the exploitation of people, then I might say that that's different. But that's where we are. That's the historical foundation that we have. It's broken. The best we can do is either to try and build on it, recognizing that it's broken, or start anew. There are people who are heavily invested in making sure that we do not start anew. And, you know, I'm not an economist, so I don't know what that would look like, and it scares me to think about it sometimes. But to your question, yes, the media is a part of that. And so the way that I trace that is I think back to how media, news media in particular, and the practice of journalism, moved from being a vocation to a profession. And so even though I went to UNC Chapel Hill, which embarrassed me in its own way this past year, UNC tries to present itself as one of the earliest journalism schools in the country. We go back and forth with the University of Missouri about this. But Mizzou is where journalism and mass communication in specific first became professionalized in terms of having to have a degree to practice it and creating a curriculum around it. Their program dates back to the late 1800s, but Mizzou did not admit its first Black student until the 1950s. That is evidence of a broken foundation. You cannot create norms, values, and practices without including multiple groups of people, multiple backgrounds and identities, and say that somehow it is representative of the public that you are trying to serve. And so that's one of the problems that news media continues to grapple with today. And I think some of the Band-Aids, like with the last image that I had, that we are trying to apply, including the push for diversity programs and the apologies that people made in 2020. We saw a lot of those and promises that they would do better. But one of the things that my next project is about reparative journalism. And so I asked the question of all the American institutions, shouldn't journalism make reparations, not necessarily pay reparations, but make reparations to the communities that it is harmed by functioning the way that it does? So thinking about how, first of all, we developed the norms for journalism, how we decided who is important and who gets to speak, how we decide what stories are selected, how we covered issues or failed to, like the Herald Leader. I think what the Herald Leader did with the series that it presented is sort of a first step in practicing reparative journalism. But basically, I say that this approach is explicit in its commitment to social and specifically racial justice, that it is cooperative, that we are working with people and we're not telling them what they need to know, but we are learning from them, giving them the platform that we have in order to produce news and information, that it requires alternative economic models. You know, there's a whole list of things that I've said, but like every other institution, from the federal government to education, if we want to try and rectify the broken foundation that we're built on, we all have to do some sort of examination. And for journalism, I believe that's where it begins.
What I'm hearing both of you say as journalists is that the dominance of a limited number of journalistic outlets, print or media, has essentially been replaced, supplanted by a more widely dispersed media, where people can curate and create their own priorities in terms of the media that they experience and want to be a part of. At the same time, voter participation has gone down significantly in those colors, in those communities, particularly communities of color, that have been most disenfranchised by media and political actors. And the flattening of access to media has been accompanied, although maybe not necessarily caused, by the disappearance of dominant media and dominant politicians. And so I wonder what the role is that this flattened social media can now play in terms of re-engaging underrepresented populations in really having a dominant role within policymaking. I mean, at the same time, we've been talking about cancel culture and critical race theory. We lost the governorship in Virginia. The number of people of color who voted in the Boston election has continued to decline. And there's been significant pushback around a number of progressive issues, even from last year to this year. So what role, if any, does social media play in mobilizing underrepresented people to have a more dominant role in policymaking that can then affect everything from districting and the effect that's going to have for the next 10 years to budgeting and the effect that that's likely to have in terms of influencing all of the money that's going to be coming out of Washington?
So before I answer that question, I want to make known my disagreement about social media replacing sort of the dominant producers of news. Social media has challenged dominant production means of news, but I open the New York Times on a daily basis. I'm a faithful yet very sad reader of the Times. I'm changing over to the Boston Globe, by the way. I'm getting there. But I see these works that are fixated on white supremacists and white nationalists that do not call those people who they are and instead refers to them as the alt-right. I see sympathy portrayals of people like Richard Spencer, who masterminded an assault on the city where I most recently lived, and details about how he can't afford a defense. I do not see details about how voters are being disenfranchised at so many different levels and what that means for voter turnout. I see superficial level stories about structurally marginalized people, not just underrepresented people, but structurally marginalized people and how they are kept from the ballot box. And so I say that social media's influence is very limited. It's a great tool, but it is not all encompassing. And it's a tool for a number of things that have actually been more destructive than they have been constructive. We're still dealing with the impact and effects of misinformation from the election. I mean, we're still dealing with that today. We have got people in Congress, elected officials, and this is why I say I have trouble with this notion of American democracy, because democracy said that those people could be elected based on the maps that they drew. Whereas people on social media have been saying the way that our electoral system is set up is outdated, that it needs to be remade and replaced, that gerrymandering is such a problem and we want to organize and push back against it, and then those very cases are decided by a system where we don't have a voice. So the things that we can do are do outcry on social media and organize. And that then that same media turns around and blames structurally marginalized people for the loss that progressives and Democratic candidates face. Those same people who say, you know, look at, I lived in Florida too. Florida made me. I say that. I tell my students, I am a thug. And I mean that in the reclamation of the word. Man, y'all are not with the laughs tonight. I say that I'm a thug because, man, doing news in Florida, that's hardcore. Reporting on Florida, man, hardcore stuff. But I look at Florida and I look at this state that twice went for Trump, that had an opportunity to elect its first Black governor, that then ratified an amendment to its state constitution to restore people who had served their time back into society so that they could vote. And not seeing details about how the governor single-handedly disabled that campaign, overrode the will of the people, and said that in order to vote, you must now pay these arbitrary court fines. You must make restitution to victims that is set by people who are not necessarily your peers. They're set by judges in the system. And you have to do this in order to vote. The two things are not at all connected. One is an economic engine for the state of Florida. The other is the political system and the system of democracy that is going to move Florida and other states forward. And even though the campaign for Amendment 4 was spearheaded on social media, and social media was significant in getting Amendment 4 ratified, it can single-handedly be undone by a governor. And then news media blames the people who were restored by their fellow citizens to be able to vote for not turning out and doing better in that state.
So I would set aside, just for the moment, the challenges of places like Florida or Texas or South Carolina, but I would look at places like Virginia or Boston or New York, where Black voter turnout ought to be affecting in positive ways the ultimate electoral outcomes, and where there is, I think, pretty significant evidence that there's a high level of social media use and penetration, and yet the voter turnout is down. In Boston and Massachusetts, we don't have the challenges that one sees in, well, we don't.
No, I don't agree.
Okay.
I vehemently disagree. Because the challenges, if we only think about the challenges in terms of whether voters are registered, then we fail to consider the complexity of our electoral system. There are districts in this area and in areas throughout the country that Black voters can turn out in record numbers, and they still cannot shift a seat from one way to another because they are not enough. The same is true for any group of voters of color. And so when we do not have news media that digs into the issues, that keeps the number of voters from structurally marginalized groups from having the collective power to elect representatives that actually intend to serve their needs, that is a disservice of news media. It's superficial reporting because it allows us to believe that these are people who just aren't voting. It doesn't get into how much money does it cost you to take time off of work, to find transportation, to produce an ID, if that's needed, depending on where you are, to go and vote, to spend time not working with your kids in their homework, but reading up on the policy issues so you're an informed voter. It does not talk about all of those issues. And so to me, it is hugely unfair to look at structurally marginalized people and say, you are not doing enough. No, your government is not doing enough. Your media is not doing enough. Your neighbors are not doing enough to help you access the agency and the power that you do have so that when you turn out to the ballot box, you get the sort of results that you're seeking.
I want to turn it over to questions from both students here and folks online, but I wanted to ask you about the attacks on social media now. So you talk on the one hand about the enormous power of, say, Black folks on Twitter and their ability to push change and so forth. But we've also seen the power of these platforms to mobilize people in the insurrection, to encourage people living within their bubbles and so forth. What is the answer to that? In other words, it seems like there's this social media universe, and the impulse now seems to be on maybe both the left and the right to somehow regulate it and stop it and control it. I'm wondering if you think that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I would never, almost never say that I want to look to the state for answers. You know, there's some gems from Ronald Reagan that I do hold dear. Trust but verify was one of them. The other one is that you've really got problems when someone shows up and they say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. But I do think that we need to consider that these communication technologies, like communication technologies of the past, do need some form of regulation. In terms of control, in terms of their publication responsibilities, in terms of how they allow users to operate. Because one thing that's often lost in those discussions is that these are private companies. And so while First Amendment rights apply to the people who use them, there is also a responsibility that the owners of the private companies have in terms of allowing specific speech on their platforms. We are seeing the lightly damaging effects of the kind of speech that is allowed unchecked on platforms like Facebook. In areas of the world like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, where Facebook basically is the internet, Facebook, WhatsApp, all of the properties that it has purchased that people use to communicate to one another. Facebook is allowing people to present messages of hate and genocide that actually lead to genocide, where people are dying because of what is allowed on Facebook. And so, if not for our comfort in the United States, then for our responsibility to the world, there has to be some sort of intervention. And there is no power that is significant enough to do that in the United States, but the federal government.
Okay, questions from the audience? Emma's got the...
All right. Thank you so much for coming. Your insight has been really, really great tonight. So on the grounds of, I don't know, this is a misconception that I have, but that there's a large swath of adults in the United States who don't necessarily use social media, who aren't really in touch with that sort of thing. You know, they might be working a lot, they're sort of upper middle age, they're not really in it. Maybe they're on Facebook, but they're sort of just using it a little bit casually. How do you involve them in these sort of conversations? How do they get exposed to what could be like a very important thing to be exposed to, like the whole conversation about Black Twitter and being able to see that this is what's happening in society, even if it, you know, is only tangentially related to them, they are a key role in being able to vote in certain ways and do things. How do you sort of start that conversation or introduce it, and is it worth doing so?
Oh, it's absolutely worth doing. And I look at it as part of the civic responsibility that we have one to another. So in the Facebook papers, one of the things that came out was that Facebook's user group is aged and aging, right? So when we consider the sort of misinformation that's available on Facebook, the audience that it's available to is one that's aged and aging. And they may not be using other social media platforms to see or hear conflicting stories, sides, opinions, facts, right? And so ultimately, what people rely on, even as they rely on Facebook for the kind of information that leads them one way or another, is they rely on the relationships that they have with the people in their lives. So as I pointed out with Black Twitter, that first level of connection is personal communities. That's the people that you know in offline life. Trust among human beings is something that platform companies are trying to harness and monetize and use to their advantage. But it cannot be replicated by machines and algorithms in the way that it can between human interaction. And so what's required is for us to be able to explain, one, how to investigate claims in a way that makes people encounter information that is factually accurate and verifiable, not doing research based on what you see on the internet and pulling out the excerpts that confirm the bias that you have, but going, for instance, to foundational documents, to primary source documents. So one of the things that I do, I had a neighbor, a Black woman, as a matter of fact, in Virginia, who asked me if I was part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was like, well, no, I'm not a part of any movement, but I study them. And she told me that she heard it was a terrorist movement. And so I took a document that I use in my class that I teach, and it's written directly by one of the women who came up with the phrase Black Lives Matter and built out the movement as a series of chapters that talked about the origins of the phrase, why it is used, and what it means. And I said, this is it from the source. Now it's like telephone. I can have a message, I can relay it to another person, they can amplify it on social media, it might change some. But ultimately, there is a source of truth, a source of verification that you can go to find out what the facts are. Whether you choose to believe them or not is sort of different. One of the other things that we can do, and I take this from one of my mentors, Siva Vaidyanathan, who's written a book about Facebook, is refuse to engage with the sort of misinformation that people see and post online. And that is using alternative channels to engage people about it. Because it doesn't matter how you engage with that misinformation. You may comment and say, this is ridiculous. Here are some links to some other stuff. Doesn't matter. Algorithms say, you engage with this, you spent time with it, you must like it. I'm going to show you and the person who posted it some more. And so that means picking up the phone, calling people, having that proverbial conversation with your uncle at Thanksgiving. And that is honestly the way that I would advocate making those kind of connections. It's the way I do it myself. My mom's 76. I've been telling my mom's age since I was like 6 years old. My mom's 76, and to this day, I talk to her about the information that she finds. I lead her to the places where she can find it, and it is verifiable, and I help her to understand the difference between fact and fiction. And it's necessary. It's up to all of us to do.
It is a fantastic job like you did today. So thank you very much for your time. Yeah. So my question is, it's around white labels, because a lot of the places I feel like they're more active in driving the narrative, but ultimately it's probably a mistake for Black or Hispanic folks just relies on supposedly Black white labels that's looking for their best interests on driving the narrative, because some of the narrative end up causing more issues. One thing I can think of, like defund the police, because I'm sure most Black people probably don't want defund the police, but that's a drive. That's something that drive by white labels. So how can we take control of the narrative? Because a lot of the places we're not there, we're not actively on social media, and some of the news, some of the newsroom, we're not there. So what other way we can take control of the narrative and having more factual out there than what's been circulated in all over?
So, thank you for that question. When I think about sort of wresting control of narratives, one of the points that I'm coming to now in my research and my scholarship is the need for collaboration rather than control, right? And it goes back to this idea that I'm thinking of where America was not built as a system of democracy, it was built as a system of dominance. And that if we continue to try and dominate conversation and dominate the way that people think about certain ideas, progressive ideas are going to continue to lose. What we need is collaboration, right? So the people that I talked to years ago and in the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, by and large, you know, there were some who said, yeah, I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in any sort of governmental structure, and I certainly don't believe in law enforcement and policing. That morphed into defund the police which is a legitimate cause that a number of people are invested in. But it morphed because there was not enough conversation about what people actually need in their communities when it comes to maintaining peace and stability and what we have. So you'll talk to a number of people, and I'm just using this as a specific case, who will say, when we say defund the police, what we mean is, yes, cut the budgets, cut the spending that allows the police to have militarized weapons. That does not give us the ample number of social workers and remediation programs and resources that people need to keep them from committing crimes or to keep them from having fatal encounters with the police when what they need are mental health services or what they need are conflict resolution services. And so in order for us to, and now you see sort of the rebound of that campaign, defund the police, and that phrase, right? Because police departments across the country are experiencing both the revision of their budgets, but also the, what's the word I'm looking for? The amped up funding of their budgets. It is the absolute reverse. And I feel that had there been more conversation about the nuance of what defund the police means, we might have been able to make greater strides in this push towards police reform to police abolishment, to creating societies in which we do not, or we rarely need people to show up with guns in order to help us to address societal problems. So I emphasize collaboration, and specifically to your point about white liberals and the ability to amplify conversation in a certain way. When I studied white allyship in the Black Lives Matter movement, I found that the two things that people needed were first to understand, to be able to cede power to those who were structurally disadvantaged, to Black folks who were structurally disadvantaged, to people who you don't necessarily consider leaders in Black communities and communities of color, and then also to take informed action from those people. So that is collaboration. It's not the, you be quiet and let us take care of this. No, you're in places that a lot of us aren't going to be able to go. You're making policies that a lot of us from out here can't influence. What we need you to do is cede the power that you have and say, instead of pushing and advocating this direction that I think we should go, I'm listening to the people who are living this. Here's what they told me. Based on what they tell me, here's what we need to do, and advocate for those policies.
How would you have incentivized that deeper conversation about the principles underlying defunding? Because in fact, there are a number of cities and towns around the country that in effect have done exactly that. They've transferred funds from the military side of policing into social services and other kinds of interventions We had students this past year who worked with a community outside of Boston, where it was found 40% of the responses that police made were about mental health issues. And so the town actually transferred funds from the police budget into a social service budget, but they didn't call it defunding the police. So how would you go about using social media to get into that deeper understanding of what it is that the appropriate responses should really be?
I would use much more than social media because a movement like creating a society that allows us to effectively and safely defund the police takes so much more than the local budget, the state budget. It is a federal level problem where we have contracts with the federal government where we incentivize police departments to use military equipment. That's a budget line that needs to be cut. So if that's in the defense budget, cut it. That's a federal issue, right? It's also an education problem. We do not have enough social workers. I was reading a story in the Times the other day about murdered children in New York City and how caseworkers are totally overburdened. There should not be, in a country as rich as ours, a lack of people who can help create a social safety net to make sure that children, if people claim that they're pro-life and pro-family, there should not be a lack of people who help create the social safety net in order for those children to remain safe, even if they can't be safe in their own families. Social workers and mental health professionals and people who are going to school for those sort of things, we need education reform. You shouldn't have to pay for that degree. You shouldn't have to choose between, I can use my time, talent for helping the community where I live, for helping people who are not as fortunate as me, and being able to get a job that allows me to pay back my student loan bills. That shouldn't be a choice. So the social media messaging has to be wide and varied and very broad, right? And I just think that social media is one tool, because how do you get people to listen to that complex of a message? We've seen that our elected officials in Congress don't even know how social media works. I do not trust them to understand the complexities that we would need to explain on social media in order for these reforms to be made. So I would say, use social media as a tool to organize and target those factors that influence the need for police and work on those key issues. But I would say recognize that social media's influence is going to be still very limited.
Great. Another question? Well, let me ask, so can you talk a little bit about, returning to the broken foundations, your work in Newsroom? So we were, in the classroom part of the class, talking about, what would things look like to make the media more responsive and more responsible. And the list is one I'm sure you're familiar with, which is hire more people of color, promote people of color, make them the decision makers, and so forth. Can you talk about, newsrooms have been saying this since the Kerner Commission. Can you talk about what you've seen in your work there and how much you think that's advancing or not? Sure.
So for the past 3 years, I have led the Newsroom Diversity Survey, which was created initially by the American Society of Newspaper Editors in 1978, 10 years after Kerner, as a response to Kerner's indictment of news media and its failure to integrate. What that survey does, and it's actually a census, I hate that they call it a survey, but what it does is take account of how many people from different backgrounds are working in originally print, but now print and digital news organizations. And I was brought on to reinvigorate this project because over the years, since we sort of hit the high point of integration in newsrooms in the 1990s to today, the response rate has dropped every single year. And it was always a project I was interested in because what I saw was there was this hyper focus on race and gender, but there was no other kind of diversity considered. One of the first changes I made to the project was to make sure that there was a way to include queer identifying journalists. And this is before there were federal workplace protections, which still aren't a magic wand making people safe in their workplaces, but at least, you know, there's law there that provides some protection. What happened in that first year was that we had our lowest response rate ever. So we sent out a query to 1,700 newsrooms across the country, all different sizes, all different sort of foci. We got about 300 newsrooms to respond with their data. And the year after that, we did a little bit better. We were somewhere around 400, still not even a third of what we had asked for. And I told the association in those first 2 years, we need to pause because we really need to rethink about how we're talking about diversity and measuring diversity. But when we took that pause, and then of course the pandemic happened, and so we lost a great deal of data. But what I saw in what I've seen in this project, not only in doing the numbers, but then moving across the country and going to different affinity group conferences, so the Black Journalists Association, the Hispanic Journalists, the Asian American Journalists, the Native American Journalists, the Gay and Lesbian Journalism Association. What I heard was, news media is doing these things. They're hiring people of color, but all the people of color are entry level. And only the ones who are willing to assimilate into this culture of exclusion that has been created historically in journalism are the ones who make it to being decision makers. They develop relationships with undercovered communities and with experts from those communities, but they only use them when they are interested in talking about their deviance and how they're somehow a problem. They don't talk to these people on just a regular basis, and they certainly don't do enough to recruit them into this workforce as equitable partners. Encouraging speaking out, that'll get you cut from a job really quickly. I think we've seen that with people like Alexis Johnson, who's currently fighting a lawsuit against the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for posting a tweet that indirectly called out how news media frames concert goers at a country music concert and so-called rioters, people who are protesting for racial justice. So there are all of these things that are taking place, but again, I go back to, with a broken foundation, all of these are Band-Aids. You have to start over. And one of the things that I say about reparative journalism in particular that people do not like to hear is that there has to be a redistribution of power. There have to be people who are in the top ranks who say, you know what, I got to the top, it was great, it's time for me to go. There have to be people who say, you know, we hired these people from structurally marginalized backgrounds so that we could improve our coverage. Let us trust them to do the job.
How would you see that happening? I mean, it's always been argued that people don't give up power, it has to be taken away from them. So how would you see the entrenched managers and owners of media, whatever the media are, actually giving up the high level of power that they have?
Yeah, power concedes nothing without a struggle. I believe that's Frederick Douglass. There are two ways that I can think of off the top of my head to go about this. One requires a very explicit personal ethical commitment, and that is training someone else. And when that person has, you know, accomplished the things that they need to do to fill that role, stepping aside and making room for them. I've seen that happen in a couple of newsrooms where people have created legacies where they've empowered people with resources to do really great journalism, and then when it's clear that that person has exceeded their limit within that particular organization, they either create a position for them to fill, or they use their power to advocate for them to get the top position at another place, but they don't leave. The other is, as we saw with the editor of the New York Times opinion page, after the Tom Cotton op-ed was published, where the senator from, I believe Tom Cotton's from Arkansas, called for effectively martial law to quell protests during the summer of 2020, where the opinion editor was fired. He was forced out because he did not listen to the people on his staff. It was not about the unpopularity or even the untruths in that op-ed. Ultimately, that was a consequence of doing hiring for being able to count people of color among your staff, but not listening to them. Because had he listened to them, he might have held on to his job, not published that op-ed, make sure that you are publishing things that are factually accurate, that are respectful and maintain human dignity for others. And if you cannot or are not willing to do that, eventually you will be pushed out. It will happen.
That seems like it would be a metaphor for all institutions, not just newsrooms, right? That should be true, kind of.
Yeah, that's why folks are
It's time
fighting.
for the 78-year-olds to go.
Well,
kind of.
and I won't say that it's time for them to go, but it is time for them to yield power. You don't have to go away. There's plenty of work that you can do. My mom's 76, and she's like, there's nothing for me to do. There's plenty for you to do. You can educate. My mother is a retired physician, and we know in recent studies that medical schools are still using textbooks that present Black bodies as somehow impervious to pain, and that there are a number of Black doctors or a number of non-Black doctors who believe that about Black people, that we are so deviant that we don't feel pain, or we don't feel it in the same way that other people do. There's plenty of work for her to do. She doesn't have to be a doctor. She can be an educator about the ethics of care. Same thing with newspapers. You don't have to be the editor. You could come to Northeastern. You could teach classes on journalism. You could work with community groups that are trying to produce their own news and can't be heard, and help them with some of the insights that you have from 40 and 50 years in a newsroom. But there are people, they are the people that are reflected in that image of January 6th, who are so used to being at the top of the racial and social hierarchy in this country, even if they are at the bottom in terms of socioeconomic status, that they will do anything to keep from losing that power. And until that shift of power actually takes place, we are going to continue to struggle that way.
One last question, yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. It's been so nice listening to you. Also have not been laughing because I don't find anything that you say funny. It's just straight up
Is
true.
it that my jokes are bad?
No,
Or?
it's not that your jokes are bad. I just don't see them as jokes. I'm just like, she's speaking the truth. Like, it's not funny. So there's that. I wanted to ask, because you're kind of what you were talking about with social workers and how they're treated and how they should be treated resonated with me so much. But it also kind of brought me back to your distrust of the state. And as you know, some of this class is, journalists and people that will be working for the future of the media. But a lot of us are people that are trying to affect policy. And I know myself, I do believe everything that you said about the broken foundation. And I find myself in my coursework and just in my life trying to strike the balance between this isn't going to work because it's broken, and also having to say, I don't know, almost in a way what people want me to say, so that I can pass a class. So what would be your recommendation? Sorry to bring you outside of your actual field, but you're so intelligent and I respect you so much that I think that you'll be able to give me an intelligent answer. What would you recommend for, people that are really genuinely in this field of trying to affect policy because they think that they can do good things. I get it. Nothing's a magic wand. And I learn more and more every day what policy is able to actually do versus what people think that it can do. What would you recommend, I guess, for those people that do have the right things in mind, if that power ever is handed to us by the 70-year-olds? What would you do?
Thank you for your trust in me. So there are two parts to that. The first is what you do educationally when you're confronted and feel like you have to give the right answer. Working inside of systems like academia, and again, this is another system where domination and subjugation is recreated every single day, right? I tell my students, yes, I have certain views. Yes, I teach from a Black feminist epistemology, which means certain political things. But if you can provide the sources and the rationale and the logic, you can have a completely oppositional view. But if you make it so ironclad that the argument that it's not valid is rendered null, then that works. You pass. And I recognize that I'm one instructor, and there are plenty of people who abuse their privilege as instructors and say, if you don't do things this way, you will not pass. I'll use my power to punish you. But what I have learned about playing the game as a Black woman, as a scholar, as a journalist, is that once you know the rules, you can break the rules. And so I look for places to break the rules or to import and interject from other fields to get people to see things in a way that they may not have considered them before. So that's the answer that I think about from a student perspective. In the working world, I think about, again, collaboration. Everyone has something. There are two things I learned in journalism. One is that everyone wants to feel heard. Whether they are understood is another story, but everyone wants to feel heard. And two, that people like to talk about themselves. And so when you are inside organizations, being keen to understand the people that you are working with, what their aims are, how they see themselves as part of the organization and part of the policymaking process, and hearing them and taking that information and using it to advance how you're wanting to make policy can carry you very far. Understanding how the machinery works, seeing some of the ways, some of the spaces for power, the levers for power that can be considered, and learning how to set those mechanisms in motion can help us do things that we did not believe possible before. That is true of the history of Black counter-narrative in media communication. It is true about Black voting rights and policy there. It is true about housing segregation and redlining. For every scheme that evil comes up with in order to continue to dominate and suppress oppressed people, there is a means of using those very same structures to fight back. I will say this, it is exhausting. And the thing that I would say to anyone who wants to do that kind of work is to learn very quickly how to take care of yourself if that is what you're going to do. I make bad jokes during these sort of things because it's my way of taking care of myself. Because if I had to just sit with this without any sort of levity, it would kill me. It would very literally kill me. So learn how to take care of yourself, learn how to understand how the machine works, look for the points of power and exploit them for good.
Oh, Professor Clark, thank you so much. It was really a terrific evening. For those of you who are going to be continuing on at Northeastern for several years, Professor Clark will not be teaching next semester, but she will be teaching next year. And you should track down her courses because they're getting, rave reviews, and I think you're a real voice for moral clarity in a very troubled profession. And I really appreciate your coming tonight. So next week, we're going to be talking about the STEM fields and their kind of involvement, but also ways in which they may be able to work towards easing problems of racism and other kinds of hatreds. And we'll be sending you the readings by the weekend.